All right. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Good evening. Welcome to the first session of the WISM, the Workshop International Survey Methods for our fall semester. So we're very excited to launch the series today with Professor Rory Fitzgerald. He's a professor of practice in survey research at the University of London and also the director of the European Social Survey. So Professor Fitzgerald has been at the forefront of advancing cross-national survey methodology, and today he'll be talking about a very timely and important development, the retirement of face-to-face data collection in the European Social Service. So Rory, thanks for being here, and please take it away.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and lovely to be here to spend some time with some fellow survey methodologists and people who are interested in survey research. I think, of course, I guess many of us like more than doing that. So I'm just going to share my slides. Can you see those, Robert? Yeah, lovely. So I'm director of the European Social Survey. I'm based at City St George's, University of London. I'm going to talk today about a really significant change in the history of the European Social Survey. European Social Survey has been going about 25 years, almost 25 years, and we're changing how we collect our data, and it's obviously a big undertaking. And I think what I'm going to be talking about today is perhaps a kind of a rare example of an input harmonized cross-national general social survey that's changing its data collection mode in a very controlled way, with all countries making the change at the same time and moving from one mode to a combination of another two modes, but all doing it in the same way. So this is what I'm going to talk about in my presentation. So a little bit about background to the mode switch and the self-completion background. So the first 9 rounds of the European Social Survey were conducted exclusively with face-to-face interviewing, and that was to prevent mode effects appearing in the data. So when the first blueprint for ESS was written, they looked at alternatives to all countries using face-to-face, and they were discounted because they often wouldn't work across all the countries back then. And it was decided it was important to have one mode to reduce the prevalence of mode effects between the countries. And for many years, we experimented looking at alternatives to face-to-face, but it was never the right time. There were too many confounding factors. We then came across the COVID-19 pandemic, and the infrastructure was forced to look more quickly at alternatives to face-to-face in a kind of real environment rather than an experimental one. And in the end, 9 of our 30 countries ended up using self-completion methods in the pandemic. After a recommendation by our strategic review panel and the successful implementation of self-completion at round 10, it was decided to transition all data collection to self-completion, and that approach is now underway. In fact, in the last few weeks, we've launched our 12th round, which is a mixed mode round, where half of our questionnaires will be conducted face-to-face and half will be self-administered. And then from round 13 onwards, which will be in 2 years' time, we will use only self-completion data collection, where the questionnaire itself will be administered either on web or on paper. So how did we get to the point where we felt we could transition to self-completion? When we were there in the pandemic, worried about how we might be able to collect data in some of the countries, we launched a 3-country push-to-web survey. And in these 3 countries, in particular in Hungary and Serbia, this was the first time for a very long time there had been much sort of self-completion data collection based on probability samples and so forth. ESS question is quite long, so we thought to start with, well, we want to test whether we can conduct the ESS using self-completion. So we conducted a 20-minute version of the ESS, and we were very reassured actually by the response rates that we achieved between 33 and 39%. And also in terms of the sample composition on key variables, is very similar to the face-to-face. So we concluded that the approach of using self-completion to conduct the ESS had promise. Now, the ESS questionnaire is long. It's about 60 minutes. And we know that in our field, there's often statements made about how long a survey can be in different modes. In my first job at Gallup in the UK, telephone surveys were never supposed to be more than 20 minutes, for example. So we were worried about self-completion ESS. So we compared in one of the 3 countries I've been to before. We went back into the field in Austria, and we compared a 50-minute and a 35-minute questionnaire. And we found a relatively small but statistically significant difference between the two, but no differences in sample composition between the 2 conditions. So we concluded that the benefits of a longer questionnaire outweighed the small difference in response rates. Thinking more broadly now, based on that information that we already had, more generally about why we're making the change, there's some other things that were going on around the same time. Face-to-face interviewing in Europe has become much more difficult to implement. Costs have been increasing very significantly in some countries. Response rates have been falling, particularly in the last 2 to 3 rounds. So this is a chart showing the response rates in the ESS from 2002 to 2024 when they were conducted face-to-face, and the average ESS response rate has fallen from just over 60% to just under 40% in about 20 years. And in ESS round 11, you can see the very lowest, ESS round 10, the very lowest response rate that was ever achieved face-to-face in ESS was actually in my home country of the United Kingdom, which was just 22%. So in addition to these falling response rates, there was also another problem that we faced. Fewer agencies were bidding to conduct the ESS. The ESS, generally known as having quite high methodological requirements that are sort of challenging for agencies. And as face-to-face has become a smaller part of what they do, in many cases, some of them decided it was no longer worth bidding. And then in 2 cases, there has now actually been 0 bids to actually do the ESS face-to-face. And we know that there's a lot of pressure in the agencies on retaining experienced interviewers. Many left in the pandemic and didn't return. There's higher turnover more generally. And there's challenges to recruit interviewers to do the work when the employment is kind of on a pay per interview basis, for example. It's not very secure. This has also led to some really long fieldwork periods where there's been capacity problems. In our last round in Switzerland, fieldwork took over 12 months. So face-to-face is really creaking in some of our countries. We also know from work that was done by colleagues who used to be involved with ESS, Bullins and Loosevelt, there's real evidence of interviewer effects. Interviewers either not following standardized interviewing procedures or exhibiting other characteristics which change how respondents might answer their survey questions. So we became increasingly worried perhaps about the quality sometimes of face-to-face interviewing. And we're really worried that going forward, whether face-to-face is going to be a viable mode for all of our countries, and we would like all of our countries to ideally be using the same modes. At the same time, in terms of self-completion, it's becoming more viable cross-nationally. So there's rising internet penetration, which supports the use of the web. In addition to European social survey testing, some of our sister surveys like European Values Study, Gender and Generation Survey, their experience has also shown reasonable response rates which can be achieved. And there's also this worsening data quality in face-to-face, but alongside that, self-completion has some advantages. So reduction in social desirability bias, no interviewer effects, the possibility of more consistency across countries. That said, there are concerns about accessibility, particularly reaching some of the lowest educated target respondents, and perhaps data quality is something else that could be a concern. We did consider whether we would allow different approaches between countries, so should some stay with face-to-face for longer, others switch earlier, some only use web, some web and paper, and so forth. But we decided to stick with a uniform approach. It's really one of the key drivers, I think, between the high use of ESS data. Data users like the harmonized approach, the input harmonization and the output that has in the data that they use. So we wanted to stick with that. So I mentioned that our 12th round is in the field. So our 12th round sample units are randomly allocated either to face-to-face or self-completion, and this will be as part of our official round 12 fieldwork. So when we publish our data, it will include the self-completion and the face-to-face data together. Of course, there will be a variable so that you can identify which mode people completed the survey in. This fits in with our idea to make a gradual transition to self-completion with embedded experiments, and we hope this will be a contribution to the field as well, to have so many countries with this mixed mode comparison. We also want to be able to provide our data users with a clear estimate of differences between the old and new modes. There's lots of talk, of course, in our field about mode effects, mode differences. Sometimes those get through to final papers and presentations of data. Sometimes they end up as a footnote, but we want our data users to be really clear on what those differences are. We also like this idea of this 12th round to be sort of a bridging round. So we've got, we're not just switching everything at one time. We're providing advice and guidance to our users. We're just about to appoint a new member of our core scientific team who will take on that role. There'll be lots of guidance and documentation. And so far, initial self-completion cooperation rates are promising. But it is a lot of work for our national teams to run these two modes side by side. So the self-completion approach itself, how does it look in a cross-national environment like ESS? So the first thing to note and to stress is that we have web and paper offered in every country. The first decision then for a national coordinator is, will they be able to use a postal first design or a fieldworker first design? So in countries where the sample frame enables the sample units to be clearly identified, where the postal service is functioning well in order that you can send invitations to those sample units and people can send back paper questionnaires, then the postal first design is used. But if in a country, for example, like Czechia, where it's not possible to send mail to addresses without a name and the sample frame doesn't have a name, then field workers will actually go to the sample units, introduce the survey, and then leave the materials. So that's the first big split, postal first, field worker first, or a combination. Then countries that are using the postal first design, web and paper questionnaires are offered to respondents across 4 mailings and contacts, an invitation, letter, and 3 reminders. And they can either use a concurrent design or a sequential design. Again, that's a matter of choice for countries, and I'll show later there's kind of a split at how they're choosing to do that. The role of the field worker where they're being used is to deliver materials and encourage participation, but not to conduct interviews, at least not at the moment. We might reconsider that in the future about whether in some restricted cases they might help a respondent, but at the moment they're not doing that. And then also not doing the within household selection, that is the next birthday method. We require an unconditional monetary incentive unless there's kind of a legal barrier to that, particularly if it's postal first, and conditional incentives are strongly recommended. So particularly in our mixed mode round 12, where we're comparing the self-completion and the face-to-face, we try to keep the questionnaires as similar as possible. And we're also trying to maintain our time series, which has been going since 2002. That means the main stimulus at each question remains the same. So we're not changing a lot of the wording in the self-completion, other than making minor changes like no reference to show cards, and of course how you fill in the question on the internet or on the paper self-completion questionnaire. There is one challenge we face, which we haven't been able to resolve. We've had to stick with the difference. In the paper self-completion questionnaire, our 11-point scales, which are quite common in ESS, have had to remain horizontal but become vertical on the web, obviously for smartphone completion. Another thing we've had to do is in self-completion, we haven't added don't knows and refuse to the screens or the paper questionnaire. Respondents are simply told they can leave any question blank. We've had to make other changes like shortening some of our education lists. We are worried a little bit about the occupation measurement. We know there we're getting a bit less information from respondents without an interviewer. We are looking at ways to improve that part of the questionnaire in the future. And we're also updating our human value scale, and there'll now be a gender neutral version of that. That helps to avoid having even more pages in your paper self-completion questionnaire if you have a male and female version. Absolutely at the heart of our transition are the communications we send to our target respondents. We were very lucky to work with the late John Dillman on our development of our materials, the invitation letters and reminders. We're lucky in many of our countries to have samples of named individuals from population registers. So that's one thing that we have in some of our countries, but not all. In many cases, our surveys, national coordinators are based in universities, so they are able to use institutional logos, which again really helps. It's not coming just from a survey agency, but from a research institute or university. We make reference at the beginning of the questionnaire to the topics that will then, in the letter that will appear in the beginning of the questionnaire, providing a clear link between those materials so that respondents stay with the survey. And the first questionnaire topics also aim to appeal, being about their local area. We have a strong reference in our communications about the survey being living in country, so it's rarely called the European Social Survey to respondents, but rather living in Spain, living in Great Britain, and so forth. And then on the front of the questionnaire, there's kind of a map with the country where the respondent is located, highlighted alongside other countries. Where possible, we try to use cash. Those of you familiar with Dillman's work will see his influence there. He was a strong advocate of that, and it is quite a novel feature to actually receive cash in many European countries in the envelope. Very controversial, not possible to do everywhere. If that's not possible, a voucher is used. And we also do other things like trying to vary the envelope sizes of the mailings and so forth to try and get people to open the letter in the first place. The self-completion platform itself is seeing a big centralization really of data collection in our infrastructure. So in the very early days of ESS, the CAPI questionnaires, paper questionnaires were all dealt with separately, but we've been gradually bringing together centralized tools, and now all of the web interviewing will take place via our partners in the Netherlands at Centre Data. So countries go in, they add their translations to our translation tool, and then those feed through automatically into the web questionnaire. And we're also actually able to generate the paper questionnaire from within that same template. This is an example of the paper questionnaire, at least in our 10th round. There's been some further revisions of that over time. An hour-long questionnaire initially seemed very long, too many pages. John Dillman recommended we try the 2-column layout, and that worked well. People are able to navigate it nicely, but it reduces the number of pages overall and makes the the questionnaire seemed less daunting. So I'm now going to move on to give you some of the initial results of how things have been going in our testing. So of course our full self-completion round has not taken place yet. Our mixed mode round's underway, but lots of countries have been doing testing, feasibility tests, pilots, or they took part in the 10th round and used self-completion. So I'm now going to give you some of the results, starting with the response rates. So the self-completion results are in green and the face-to-face results here are in blue. And response rates, mostly of course an indicator of process quality rather than outcome quality, and I'll give an example of that later. But still an important measure nonetheless. We need people to be taking part, cooperating with our surveys and to make the whole process of communication, etc., effective. And face-to-face response rates, despite the declines I showed earlier, generally still been higher than in self-completion. And in a few cases like Cyprus, Slovakia, Czechia, and Serbia, response rates in self-completion are much lower. However, I would note that in the last 2 to 3 years, in many of those countries, actually, there's been a really further steep decline in their response rate. And now, for example, in Czechia, agencies won't really promise more than 30% face-to-face data collection. In some countries, response rates have been very close to each other or even higher in self-completion, like in Germany, the UK and Sweden. It's Ireland that achieved the highest self-completion response rate so far, at 43% in one of our recent pilots. One of the other things you might notice is with face-to-face data collection, there was a big variation in the response rate. So in the 10th round, for example, they were varying from the low of 22% in Great Britain, well up to over 70%, for example, in parts of Eastern Europe. And now, where countries follow the specification, response rates tend to all be between 30 and 40%. It's my strong belief that self-completion response rates in many of these countries can improve with some modest changes to communications and incentives, plus the use of field workers for non-response follow-up. One of the things I didn't mention earlier is that some of the countries starting with postal first, at the end of the field work, there will be a field worker follow-up phase, not targeted in this round, perhaps targeted in future rounds. So, for example, in the UK, once they've finished all their mailings, they will send field workers out for 2 visits to all the addresses which haven't yet responded. Breaking this down a little bit more by mode, and the ESS transition at the moment really is to both web and paper and not just to web. It would have been much more convenient for us as researchers if it was all on the web. You know, we could all do loads of those experiments, things would be faster and cheaper. But I'm strongly of the view at this point that that would have been a premature change. And just look at the proportions of data collections which have taken place in paper. A few other things to note. For example, in Poland, they did have a field worker follow-up phase when they did their data collection in the 10th round, self-completion, and that led to an additional 6 percentage point increase in the response rate. Israel, they used field worker first design. They're unable to use the postal system there with the sample frame that we have access to. And Serbia also had a field worker follow-up phase. Here's another selection of the countries. There's Ireland at the top, who did our pilot I mentioned before. They used a postal and field worker hybrid approach in Ireland. That's because some of the addresses are unique. You can therefore send a letter to the addresses on the sample frame. Some are non-unique addresses. You're not able to do that. You have to send a field worker to locate the specific address. So they used a hybrid design. They did get the highest response rate. It's pretty consistent, actually, even between the field worker first and postal first parts. Other countries have also been using field worker first. You can see Lithuania, Bulgaria and Czechia had to use that approach. Slovakia, quite a low response rate there, but they were able in their feasibility test, which is the data mentioned here, only to use conditional incentives. They will now be moving, or are moving in this next 12th round, to use unconditional incentives as well. So cooperation rates are one part, of course, of our surveys and response rates, but we know that's not all that matters. So the sample composition is pretty important. So I'm going to give you some examples of how we've looked at the sample composition, comparing the most recent face-to-face rounds in the ESS with the most recent self-completion data. So the yellow dots on this chart here show the population benchmark, usually the census, but sometimes another source. And the green dots show the self-completion proportion weighted by the design weight, but not post-stratification weight. That's the same throughout when I'm presenting data from the modes. So the chart shows that for each country, the self-completion sample, how the self-completion sample differs from the population in terms of the proportion of women included. And we can see that in almost all countries, self-completion tends to overrepresent the number of females very slightly, and sometimes a little bit more than slightly, for example, in the Czech Republic and Cyprus. In this chart, I now add in the face-to-face data as well. So you have the face-to-face data, the self-completion data, and the population benchmark. Face-to-face is in the darker blue color on the screen. Both self-completion and face-to-face tend to overrepresent women, but self-completion does this a little more than the face-to-face. In Austria, for example, the face-to-face overrepresents women somewhat, whilst the self-completion matches the population, but that's quite rare. Latvia and Hungary, where the face-to-face grossly overrepresents women, the self-completion, it's close to the population, so it's an improvement there. Whereas in Serbia, women are generally underrepresented in self-completion, and we found that actually that was something to do with the way in which the letters were written. But generally here, these differences are quite small, and post-stratification weighting would account for most of them pretty well. Now I'm going to move on to age. And first, we're talking about those who are the youngest in our survey, so those under the age of 25. So the green circles again show the self-completion proportion in comparison to the population shown in yellow. And in general, self-completion was close to the benchmark, but there are some exceptions. For example, Ireland, Hungary, GB, Cyprus, and Sweden, self-completion is underrepresenting the youngest somewhat. Now I'm going to add in the face-to-face data as well. This chart again has the design-weighted data for the face-to-face, so both the self-completion and the face-to-face are weighted by the design weight. And we can see here that self-completion is generally better at including those under 25 compared to face-to-face. Of the 14 countries shown here, there was 2 in which face-to-face was close to the population, 5 where there was no difference, and 7 where self-completion was closer. Now I'm moving on to the oldest respondents, so those aged 75 and over. Again, the self-completion proportion here is shown in green and the population in yellow. Of the 14 countries, which I'm showing here, in 5 there was no difference is compared to the population. In 6, there was an underrepresentation of the eldest, and 3, an overrepresentation. Again, I'm now adding in the face-to-face data. And again, the face-to-face is the dark blue. Compared to the population, 6 had an overrepresentation of the eldest in face-to-face, 5 no statistically significant difference, and 3 an underrepresentation. When comparing self-completion and face-to-face comparatively, which was closer to the population than the other, there are actually few differences when taking into account the confidence intervals. Face-to-face was close to the population in Israel and Austria, but self-completion was a bit closer in Great Britain, Czech Republic, and Cyprus. In all other countries, there was no statistically significant difference. So what we've been seeing here, both with gender and with age, is whilst there are some differences, in general, they're relatively small. In general, the types of things which post-stratification weighting could handle quite nicely. Lastly, in terms of sample composition, I'm going to turn to education. Yes, thank you. So in this chart, we see the proportion achieving tertiary education or higher. So that's the what the chart shows. What percentage of the population of tertiary education or higher shown in yellow, and then the proportion achieved in our sample. The table shows that paper self-completion includes an underrepresentation of respondents with tertiary education or above compared to the population. This is a significant concern, really, in the sense with the change, and the area that we need to focus on the most in future is how to reach the less educated. How does that compare with the face-to-face? In general, the face-to-face is actually closest to the population in terms of education. In 7 out of our 14 countries, self-completion performed worse than face-to-face, 3 better, and in 4 no significant difference. So we need to do more to try and reach these groups. What I would say is what we wouldn't want to be doing is a web-only survey, because you can see here that in all of the countries, the paper questionnaire is bringing in less educated respondents. This is why the paper is a key component of what we do, and is not something which we will be able to take away in the immediate future. Now I'm going to move on in the last part of the presentation to talk about mode effects. And we've done some comparisons using our 9th and 10th rounds. We commissioned a special advisor to the European Social Survey, Peter Lugtig from the University of Utrecht. And he compared ESS round 9, all the countries used face-to-face, and then ESS round 10, and he compared countries who did and did not switch. So of course it's not a perfect experiment, but it gives some indication of what the impact of the mode switch was. He focused on standardized mean differences, standardized difference in variance and covariances in the ESS core questionnaire. So that's the part of our questionnaire we repeat every time. And his general finding is that there's small but notable differences in means between face-to-face and self-completion. They were only observed for about 20% of our core questionnaire. So there was some reassurance here that the impact of the mode switch was going to be a bit limited, but not for all parts of our questionnaire. His key finding is that differences in means were often driven by the higher frequency of endpoint answers given in self-completion. But little or no effect was observed for variances and covariances. Country-specific mode effects have also been observed, so everything's not always uniform in that way. What you can see here on the y-axis, the vertical axis, you can see the differences between the round 9 face-to-face and round 10 self-completion. And on the x-axis, you can see the differences between round 9 face-to-face, the time effect. And there is, as expected, lots of stability in variables. And most variables only change a little, slightly due to time. So as is usual with the ESS core questionnaire, there's quite slow change and there's actually a lot of stability. So you can see that as we move left to right. But as we move up the chart, of course, we can see the bunching to the left-hand side. We can see the countries that switched between face-to-face and self-completion observed more changes in their variables. It's not a perfect experiment. Could be that these countries, there was something about COVID that impacted them more, but it's unlikely. It appears that the mode switch has led to some changes there. So I'm just going to give one little example now from our democracy module, where we repeated the democracy module that was included in ESS round 6 and round 10. And there's a set of underlying core concepts which are measured by different individual questions in the questionnaire. And they cover things like support for democracy, direct democracy, and so forth. I'll show some of the examples in a minute. There are two parts of the questionnaire. First of all, they ask what people think is important for democracy in general, and then to evaluate how those are functioning in their own country. In 2 countries, there was a parallel run of face-to-face and self-completion in our 10th round. So I'm going to look at some of the results from that experiment. 2 questions, sets of questions. These are the ones that are called views. So how important do you think certain things are for democracy in general, like having free and fair elections, different political parties offer clear alternatives to one another, the media are free to criticise the government, and so forth. And respondents would rate each of these and how important they were for democracy on an 11-point scale. And then after they'd done that, they were asked to go through the same list again and say to what extent they think those things apply in their country. So an evaluation. So we had some hypotheses that the democracy module should probably have a low interviewer effect. It's not likely to be particularly controversial in terms of social desirability, not in the European context then at least. Sample composition between the face-to-face and self-completion should be similar based on earlier self-completion tests in those 2 countries, and that there be no major differences between the data should then probably be observed. Actually, we did find that the sample composition was very similar between the face-to-face and self-completion in Great Britain and Finland, but when it comes to means difference analysis, many of the items show significant differences. So this is a comparison of the mean scores in Great Britain and Finland between the face-to-face and self-completion. Figures in red are statistically significant. Higher mean scores for face-to-face and self-completion in both countries. The mean score differences between self-completion and face-to-face across all items with 0.42 in Great Britain and 0.24 in Finland. And similarly for the evaluations, we found, again, higher mean scores in higher mean scores in for face-to-face in all of our countries, in both countries. We then moved on to look at the correlations between items expected to measure the same concept. We looked at the composite scores and the relationships proposed by the theoretical model. Average scores for each of the democracy concepts using the indicator items. This table shows the direction and strength of the relationships between the composite scores of the different democracy concepts for the views items. In Great Britain, the correlations are the same in both modes, all except for one. All the differences are quite minimal. For example, between liberal and direct democracy, the strength of the relationship changes a little bit between modes. In Finland, some of the face-to-face correlations are weaker than the self-completion ones, and in 2 cases, no correlations were found in the face-to-face, but they were in the self-completion. There are no situations in which the correlational differences are very large between the modes, and the mode differences in each country context are relatively small or non-existent. So this was reassuring. Whilst there were some differences in the mean scores, the correlations were working fairly similarly despite the mode change. So, reflections and outlook. The European Social Survey, really, we've had little option but to change mode. We could have tried to hang on to face-to-face, but in a sense, for us, where we commission different agencies in different countries and the range of countries we have, face-to-face was not really going to be viable. We are fortunate that our questionnaire works in paper self-completion. I think it'd be much more tricky, is much more tricky if you can't get that paper complement at the moment. I think we've achieved reasonable response rates so far. In fact, we've been quite happy and reassured by them, but we hope to improve further. Sample representativeness is generally similar or better than face-to-face, but worse for education. I forgot to mention that it was Ireland, of course, that got the highest response rate. Ireland also had one of the most significant deviations in terms of the education data, so that's quite interesting. Paper is clearly essential for providing balance, but we do need more targeting and efforts to include the less educated. And actually today we've been finalising a proposal which we've submitted to try and do more work on accessibility of self-completion instruments. Little or no mode effect is expected for variances and covariances, but some point estimates are going to be impacted, and there will be some country-specific differences. Self-completion clearly comes with negatives. We are now going to be mixing paper and online, so we'll have mixed mode going forward rather than single mode. Occupation variables, we need to do more to improve how we can capture that. There are response rate declines, and on some of the data quality, I mean, I didn't present that today, but for example, in the GB experiment where we compared that, you know, there is, for example, slightly higher item non-response in self-completion, for example. But it's not dramatic, and I think there are things that we can and have done to improve on those. There are many benefits. We're getting rid of interviewer effects, less social desirability, and really this consistency between countries now with the central web server. I think that's a real improvement to our operations. We're hoping to reduce the impact on the time series as far as possible, but it's not going to be possible to do that completely. We'll have a lot of information for you. We hope many of you will be interested in looking at some of our data. This is probably, we think, one of the largest ever mixed mode experiments conducted across nationally, so we're hoping it will be a resource for everyone. Paper is crucial for now. Will it be needed in the future? Let's see. Lastly, I just wanted to mention European Social Survey is very much a team effort. My colleagues in the core scientific team, national coordinators, and our advisory boards are all part of this. And here is our national coordinators from a meeting in the past. I'll end there. Happy to take some questions in the remaining period. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rory, for such a great presentation, sharing your insights. Yeah, let's open the floor for questions of our audience. You may raise your hand, type in the chat, or just speak up. So let's start with Hannah.
Thank you for doing this because I applaud anyone who provides survey data. I don't pay for it. But I noticed I actually used the Israel Self-Complete survey in the last wave for an analysis, and one thing I noticed across the waves is that in the self-complete there was a dramatic drop-off in the number of people who answered to some of the demographic questions, like the religion question just got a massive increase in skips. Sorry. I have a cat. And so I wondered if there were other countries that had a large change. You mentioned the education variable, but in response patterns across the demographics that don't just seem like you're getting a different audience, but that some people are backing out of what might otherwise seem like a neutral question.
With religion specifically, or just more generally?
That's the one I noticed in Israel, that a lot of people suddenly said, I have no religion. But if there's other, if you looked at the demographic across.
So you're saying that people answered differently, or they didn't answer?
there were a lot of people who suddenly clicked like I have no religion that I've not seen on any other survey in Israel, even the previous ESS surveys. So I wondered if other countries had had demographic differences in the self-complete model, not necessarily
You
from invited in, but just like did they suddenly stop answering questions?
I don't think so. I think there were some specific issues with the survey in Israel. Is that the country that you were looking at?
Yes.
Yeah, I think they had some specific difficulties there with the way in which it was implemented the first time, which they've improved on this time for the future, specifically around some of the contacting procedures that they use. So that might be partly behind it, but I wasn't actually aware of that. So we'll need to look into specifically that question in Israel.
Okay.
I will do that. Thank you.
Sorry.
I'll make a note.
Questions? Yes, Daniel.
Hi, Rory. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Daniel Montalvo at the Center for Global Democracy. I do have a question regarding the sampling strategy that you use for the self-completion surveys. We have been talking in LAPOP about the possibility of conducting some online surveys as well, but we find it difficult to find reliable sampling frame to draw the samples from. So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about how you go about drawing the samples for the studies.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually something which isn't really changing compared to the face-to-face. So there's a group of ESS countries, it's close to half of them, who are the lucky group where we're able to get access to the population register. So some countries have a single population register where all residents of the country are listed, and we're able to access that for sampling. So the Scandinavian countries, for example, have that, or in Germany, they're able to construct that by first selecting different municipalities and then getting the list within that area. So those countries are the lucky ones. The next set of countries are ones which we go for an equivalent design, but it's not as efficient. So, for example, there's other registers like the Post Office address file in the UK, which is a list of all residential post boxes. So you're able to select all residences to do that. And then when you get to the household, you then have to either use something like the KISS grid, which was done in the past, or the next birthday method, which is what we do now. In a small number of other countries, they have to use enumeration. So they actually have to select addresses or select municipalities or a set of addresses in the first place, and then send an enumerator there to actually select the precise sampling unit for the survey, and that's what's done in Greece. So we do a lot of work with each country. They have to discuss their sampling design with ESS. In advance, it has to be signed off. And if there is clustering, for example, or deviations from simple random sampling, then the gross sample required increases, so the countries can try and get to the 1,500 effective. But a lot of it comes down to those frames, and with the move to self-completion, in almost all cases, we're still using the same frame as we did for face-to-face.
Okay.
I guess, and maybe in the areas that you're working, it sounds like maybe those frames don't exist, or you can't get access to them.
Yeah, that's correct. It is very tricky to find like an address-based sampling frame in many Latin American countries. Probably all of them don't have something similar to that. We do have our samples that we use for the Americas Barometer, but then we will have to send interviewers to have the respondents complete the surveys either online or on paper, or maybe even phone calls. But there's no other alternatives, as far as I know, for selecting a probability sample of people in the countries we work in.
So in a third of our countries, we are having to use the field workers, because it might be that we can often draw the sample units, identify the sample units, but we can't get a letter to that sample unit to ask them to do the survey. So we have to send a field worker to those addresses.
Okay. And then in future rounds, are you going to use, or are you going to select different households? Or are you selecting the same household with a different respondent, or are you using the same respondent?
No, we go to a completely different set of households. So every round of the ESS is a new cross-section. We do have a separate follow-up survey called Kronos, where we do go back to respondents who agree to be recontacted, but that's separate from the main ESS, which is a new cross-section done each time.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, building up on Daniel's question, Rory, from your results, looks like the field work delivery of the postal cards, it's really important, right? It makes a big difference. Or is it like the paper versus web option to respond more important here?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
So I'm trying to gauge what improves the response rates. Is it the field work delivery, like the in-person contact with the respondent, or is it, or like the option of like giving the paper or web alternative for respondents that like improves response rates better?
So there's no evidence actually necessarily that field workers can get a higher response rate than just a written communication. Certainly, I mean, we haven't got parallel run experiments of that, but there's no evidence that the countries using field workers are outperforming the countries that are using the post. Obviously, having a functioning postal service is crucial, and one of the worries for the future is what will happen if postal services end up being withdrawn or reduced. Already, kind of the frequency of delivery is declining. Denmark are not in the European Social Survey, but they have recently announced they're stopping their state-funded postal service in the future. So that's an issue. I think the real key, of course, is getting people to open the letter in the first place. And then it really comes down to that unconditional incentive, the way the letter is written and who the sponsor is.
Right.
I'm pretty certain, for example, if you don't have a good sponsor on there, you're going to get much lower response rate. So we know that, like for example, the European Union agencies that run surveys in Europe, when they've tried to use self-completion methods, of course, they don't have these universities. They don't necessarily have the sample frame. They just have an agency who's commissioned to do all the work, and they get much lower response rates.
Thank you. There is a common question from Patrick. He'd like to know more about the cost structure of the self-completion versus the face-to-face. And if within the self-completion, the relative cost of web versus paper administration. So basically,
what was the first part of that question? It was the
cost structure of the self-completion versus the face-to-face.
Okay, I can only give an example at the moment for Great Britain when we did this parallel run experiment in the 10th round, and the face-to-face was 5 times more expensive than self-completion.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And in terms of
sorry, I just want to add one thing to that actually.
Oh, yeah.
That's Great Britain. That's a country that has high labour costs. Yeah. So in countries where there are high labour costs, we know from speaking to our national coordinators that the self-completion is much cheaper. In countries where labour costs are much lower, this changes and may even in some cases where labor costs are very low, switches the other way. And then the need to do all the mailings, the printing, the incentives can actually make self-completion a bit more expensive than face-to-face. So I can't actually extrapolate this necessarily to the region you're working in, but I can imagine that maybe that would even be the case. Yeah. It's not always cheaper.
And the second question is about inside the self-completion, the cost of the web versus the paper surveys. Is there a big difference cost there?
Yeah, I think the paper surveys are about 3 times more expensive. We have quite small samples, really. It's not like we've got 60,000 completes or anything per country. So at the moment, most of the countries are choosing to use manual keying questionnaires rather than scanning. And I think that is obviously quite expensive and more error prone. So it definitely comes at a cost.
Yeah. Any last burning questions? I'll take that as a no. So this was a great way to open the talks of our fall semester. Please mark your calendars for our next talk on October 8th with Professor Consuelo Amat from Johns Hopkins University. And she will be talking about a meta-analysis of field experiments in authoritarian countries. So I will send the reminder to our mailing list ahead of it. And with that, I think we can wrap up our today's session. Thank you for being here, and I look forward to seeing you next month. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Goodbye.